The thunderous crack of a rifle shot echoed across the dusty plains of Montana Territory as Theresa Watson ducked behind the overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. It was 1878, and the journey west had promised a new beginning, not an ambush by desperate outlaws who had been trailing their small wagon train since they'd left Fort Benton 3 days ago. "Stay down, Miss Watson," Ethan Zachary shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos of gunfire. The trail guide's weathered face was set with determination as he fired back at the bandits from behind a large boulder. Theresa had only known Ethan for the 2 weeks since her father had hired him to guide them to their new homestead near Helena, but in that time, she'd come to respect the quiet cowboy with eyes the color of the summer sky. At 26, he was only 4 years her senior, but carried himself with the confidence of a man who had lived twice that long on the frontier. "Where's my father?" she called out, straining to see through the billowing dust. The last she'd seen of Howard Watson, he'd been trying to calm the spooked horses. "Made it to those rocks with the Millers," Ethan called back, gesturing toward an outcropping some 50 yards away where she could just make out her father's distinctive gray hat. Relief flooded her veins like cool water. The bandits Theresa counted at least 5 of them had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the trail. They'd chosen their ambush point well, catching the small wagon train in a narrow pass where escape was nearly impossible. Their leader, a man with a red bandana covering the lower half of his face, shouted something to his companions that Theresa couldn't make out. "They're after the payroll," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. Her father, a banker by trade, was transporting funds to open a new branch in Helena. It wasn't a fortune, but to men like these, it might as well have been. "We need to move," Ethan said, suddenly appearing at her side. His presence was solid and reassuring, even in the midst of danger. "They're working their way down. We'll be flanked if we stay here." Theresa nodded, gathering her courage. She'd left Boston as a wide-eyed Easterner 6 months ago, but the journey west had already begun to harden her soft edges. "Where to?" Ethan pointed to a stand of cottonwoods about 100 yards back down the trail. "There. Better cover, and there's a creek behind it. If things get worse, we can follow it out of this pass." A bullet splintered the wood of the wagon just inches from Theresa's head, making her flinch. Ethan's expression darkened. "On my count," he said, checking the ammunition in his Winchester. "Ready yourself, Miss Watson." Theresa clutched her skirts, preparing to run. Her practical traveling dress was hardly suited for a dash across open ground, but she had little choice. 1. Ethan began, his eyes scanning the ridge. 2. Before he could reach 3, shots rang out from a new direction, the cottonwoods they'd been planning to reach. Ethan cursed under his breath as 2 more bandits emerged from the trees. "They've surrounded us," Theresa whispered, fear clutching at her throat. "Not quite," Ethan replied, his mind clearly working through their dwindling options. "But we need to change our plan." He glanced toward a rocky outcropping that jutted out from the hillside about 70 yards to their right. "That's our best bet now. I'll go first, draw their fire. You follow when I signal." "That's suicide," Theresa protested, grabbing his arm. The rough fabric of his duster was comforting beneath her fingers. Ethan's eyes softened momentarily as they met hers. "I've faced worse odds, Miss Watson." Before she could argue further, he tipped his hat to her with a half-smile that made her heart skip despite their dire circumstances. Then he was gone, darting from behind the wagon in a crouch, firing as he moved to draw the bandits' attention. Theresa watched, breath held, as bullets kicked up dust around Ethan's boots. He made it halfway to the outcropping before dropping to one knee to return fire more accurately. His shots found their mark. One of the bandits on the ridge clutched his shoulder and fell back. The air crackled with gunfire, but a momentary lull came as the bandits reloaded. Ethan turned toward her and waved urgently. Gathering her skirts, Theresa ran, her lungs burning as she pushed herself faster than she'd ever moved before. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks that threatened to turn her ankles, but fear gave her feet wings. She was 20 yards from the outcropping when she heard Ethan shout a warning. The red bandana leader had spotted her. Time seemed to slow as she saw the man raise his rifle, taking aim. Ethan's body slammed into hers from the side, propelling them both toward the rocks as a shot rang out. They tumbled behind the outcropping in a tangle of limbs and dust, and Theresa found herself pinned beneath the cowboy's weight. "Are you hit?" Ethan asked urgently, his face inches from hers. "No, she began, then noticed the dark stain spreading across his side, just below his ribs. "But you are." Ethan grimaced, shifting to sit with his back against the rocks. "It's nothing," he said, though the tightness around his eyes belied his words. Theresa scrambled to her knees, examining the wound. The bullet had torn through his side, leaving a ragged hole that was bleeding steadily. "This is not nothing, Mr. Zachary." More shots peppered their position, sending stone chips flying. Ethan raised his Winchester one-handed and fired back, his jaw clenched against the pain. "We're pinned down," he said, voice strained. "And they know it." Theresa peered around the edge of the rocks. The red bandana leader was directing his men to spread out, clearly planning to surround their position. In the distance, she could see her father and the other travelers returning fire from their position, but they were too far away to provide meaningful help. "My father," she began. "Has his hands full," Ethan finished. "We're on our own for now." He fired again, then slumped back, his face alarmingly pale beneath his tan. The blood from his wound had soaked through his shirt and vest, dripping onto the dusty ground beneath him. "You need a bandage," Theresa said, looking around desperately for something to use. They had nothing, no supplies, no water, nothing but the clothes on their backs. Ethan's breathing grew more labored as he tried to reload his rifle. His usually steady hands fumbled with the cartridges, dropping one. "Damn," he muttered. Making a swift decision, Theresa reached for the hem of her dress. The forest green cotton was sturdy, designed for the practical needs of frontier travel. With a determined yank, she tore a long strip from the bottom, revealing her ankle and calf. "Miss Watson," Ethan protested weakly, propriety warring with necessity even as blood continued to seep from his wound. "Now is hardly the time for modesty, Mr. Zachary," she replied crisply, tearing another strip. The sound of ripping fabric seemed unnaturally loud in the brief lull between gunshots. Working quickly, she folded one piece into a pad and pressed it against the wound. Ethan hissed in pain but didn't pull away. Using the second strip, she bound the makeshift bandage tightly around his torso, her fingers working with surprising steadiness despite the danger surrounding them. "You've done this before," Ethan observed, watching her face. "I volunteered in a military hospital during the last year of the war," she explained, tying off the bandage. "I was only 16, but they needed all the help they could get." Her father had disapproved of her volunteering. It wasn't proper for a banker's daughter to be exposed to such things, but Theresa had been stubborn even then. The skills she'd learned were proving invaluable now. "Good job," Ethan said, pressing a hand to the bandage. It was already beginning to show spots of red, but the bleeding had slowed. "But we're still in trouble." He was right. The bandits were getting bolder, creeping closer to their position. One had worked his way to a large boulder not 30 yards away and was firing regularly, forcing them to keep their heads down. "How many bullets do you have left?" Theresa asked. Ethan checked his ammunition belt. 7 in the rifle, 12 for reloading. "My revolver has 5. He looked grim. "Not enough if they rush us." Theresa felt cold dread settle in her stomach. She refused to die here, in this dusty pass, at the hands of men who wanted nothing more than the money her father carried. "We need a distraction," she said, her mind working furiously. "Something to give the others time to reach us." Ethan's eyes scanned the terrain, then widened slightly. "The wagon." "If we could reach it, it's too far," Theresa objected. "And you're in no condition to run." "Not for that," Ethan said. "The cargo. Your father packed blasting powder for clearing land at the new homestead, didn't he?" Understanding dawned on Theresa's face. "Yes, a whole crate of it. If we could get to it, create an explosion." Ethan trailed off, the implications clear. It was a desperate plan, but they had few options. "I'll go," Theresa said firmly. "Absolutely not," Ethan responded, trying to push himself to his feet. The movement sent fresh blood seeping through the bandage, and he fell back with a grunt of pain. "You can hardly stand, Mr. Zachary," Theresa pointed out. "I'm faster, and they'll be less likely to shoot at a woman." She hoped the latter was true, at least. "These aren't gentlemen, Miss Watson," Ethan warned. They won't hesitate to put a bullet in you if they think you're a threat. Then I'll have to make sure they don't see me as one, she replied, already forming a plan. Cover me when I signal. Before he could protest further, she tore another strip from her dress, this one much longer. The fine cotton fabric gave way with a satisfying rip, leaving her skirt scandalously short by Boston standards. Out here, survival trumped propriety. Tying the strip of fabric to Ethan's rifle, she created a makeshift flag. When I wave this, fire as many shots as you can at the men on the ridge. Keep their heads down. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but the determination in her eyes must have convinced him. Be careful, he said simply. Theresa nodded, then slipped around the edge of the rocks, staying low. The bandits were focused on Ethan's position, giving her a few precious seconds of invisibility as she darted from one scant bit of cover to the next. Her heart pounded in her ears as she made her way back toward the overturned wagon. 20 yards. 15. A bullet kicked up dust near her foot, but she didn't stop. 10 yards. 5. Finally reaching the wagon, she pressed herself against its underside, grateful for the meager protection it offered. The crate of blasting powder would be with her father's personal effects in the back compartment. She crawled forward, mindful of exposing herself to the bandits' line of sight. The wagon's contents had spilled when it overturned, but the crate remained strapped down, its lid cracked from the impact. Theresa worked quickly, prying it open and retrieving several sticks of the volatile explosive and a small box of matches her father always kept nearby for his pipe. Now for the hard part. She needed a position where the explosion would create maximum distraction without harming her father or the other travelers. The ridge where the bandits had first appeared would be perfect if she could reach it. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the flag she'd created and waved it vigorously above the wagon. Immediately, Ethan's rifle began firing, the shots coming steadily despite his injury. The bandits returned fire, concentrating on his position rather than the seemingly abandoned wagon. Theresa ran, clutching the blasting powder to her chest. Her shortened skirts gave her more freedom of movement than she'd ever experienced, allowing her to scramble up the rocky slope with surprising speed. Bullets whizzed past as one of the bandits finally spotted her, but she kept moving, zigzagging as she'd seen Ethan do earlier. Reaching a cluster of boulders near the top of the ridge, she wedged the sticks of blasting powder into a crevice where several of the bandits had taken position. Her hands trembled as she struck a match, the small flame dancing in the slight breeze. "Hey," a rough voice shouted. One of the bandits had spotted her. She heard the ominous click of a hammer being cocked. Without hesitation, Theresa touched the match to the fuse, which caught with a hiss. Then she was running again, hurling herself down the slope as the bandit's shot went wide. "Fire in the hole," she screamed, a phrase she'd heard the miners use when her train had passed through the Colorado territories. The explosion rocked the ridge, sending rocks and debris flying. The bandits scattered, several thrown off their feet by the blast. Taking advantage of the confusion, her father and the other travelers broke cover, firing at the disoriented outlaws as they rushed toward Ethan's position. Theresa made it back to the outcropping just as her father reached them, his face a mask of worry and relief. "Theresa, thank God you're safe," Howard Watson exclaimed, embracing his daughter briefly before turning his attention to Ethan. "Zachary, you're hit." "I'll live," Ethan said grimly, though he looked worse than when Theresa had left him. The bandage she'd fashioned was soaked through, and his face had taken on an ashen quality that frightened her. "The bandits?" she asked. "Running for the hills," one of the other travelers, Joseph Miller, reported with satisfaction. "Your explosion scared them half to death, Miss Watson. Thought the cavalry had arrived with cannons." "We need to get Mr. Zachary to a doctor," Theresa said, kneeling beside the injured cowboy. "The bleeding won't stop." Her father frowned, examining the wound. "Nearest doctor's in Helena, 2 days' ride at best." "Then I'll have to do what I can," she insisted, already tearing more strips from her increasingly shorter dress. Howard Watson's eyebrows rose at his daughter's appearance, but he wisely said nothing about propriety in the face of their situation. "Miller, help me get Zachary to the intact wagon. Mrs. Miller, see if you can find the medical supplies that were packed." As the men carefully lifted Ethan, he caught Theresa's hand. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice weak, but his eyes bright with admiration. "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted with a small smile. "Rest now, Mr. Zachary. You're not leaving this earth on my watch." His fingers tightened briefly around hers before he was carried away to the wagon. Theresa followed, her ruined dress fluttering around her calves, her mind already occupied with what would be needed to save the cowboy's life. The remaining daylight was spent reorganizing the wagon train and tending to Ethan. The bandits had fled, but no one wanted to remain at the site of the ambush. They traveled another 5 miles before making camp in a more defensible position near a small stream. Theresa worked tirelessly, cleaning Ethan's wound with boiled water and applying a poultice of herbs she'd learned about from a Cherokee woman during their journey through the Eastern Territories. Mrs. Miller helped, bringing fresh bandages and broth to keep the injured man's strength up. The bullet went clean through, Theresa reported to her father as night fell. "That's fortunate, but he's lost a lot of blood." Howard Watson nodded gravely. "Will he make it?" Theresa looked over at Ethan, who had fallen into a fitful sleep in the back of the wagon. "He has to," she said simply. Her father studied her face in the firelight, seeing something there that made his expression soften. "You've grown fond of our guide." It wasn't a question, and Theresa didn't treat it as one. "He saved my life, father." "And you saved his," Howard replied. "From what Miller tells me, that explosion was quite spectacular." A small smile touched Theresa's lips. "It served its purpose." "Indeed." Her father hesitated, then added, "Your mother would have been proud." She had the same spirit, though society did its best to tame it. The mention of her mother, gone 5 years now, brought a lump to Theresa's throat. "Thank you, father." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Get some rest, Theresa. I'll watch over Zachary for a few hours." Though exhausted, Theresa found sleep elusive. She lay on her bedroll near the wagon, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the occasional murmur of Ethan's voice as fever dreams took him. Around midnight, she gave up the pretense of sleep and relieved her father, taking up position beside the injured cowboy. Ethan's face was flushed with fever, his skin hot to the touch when she placed a cool cloth on his forehead. "Easy," she murmured as he stirred restlessly. His eyes fluttered open, fever bright but lucid. "Miss Watson," he rasped. "You should be sleeping," she chided gently. "Hard to sleep when a bullet's been through you," he replied, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace. Theresa helped him sip water from a tin cup, supporting his head with her hand. The intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on her, nor the way his hair, damp with sweat, curled around her fingers. "Thank you," he said after drinking. "For everything." Not many ladies would tear their dresses to bandage a rough cowboy. Not many cowboys would take a bullet for a lady they barely know, she countered. Ethan's gaze held hers in the dim light of the lantern. "I know enough," he said softly. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and possibilities. Then Ethan winced, the pain breaking the spell. "You need rest," Theresa said, adjusting his blanket. "We still have a long journey ahead." "We'll make it," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "I promise to get you to Helena safely, and I aim to keep that promise." "Even if it kills you?" Theresa asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "It won't," he assured her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I have something to live for now." His fingers were warm around hers, calloused from years of hard work, yet somehow gentle. Theresa found herself holding on, drawing strength from his touch even as she knew she should be the strong one now. "Sleep, Mr. Zachary," she whispered. "I'll be here." His eyes drifted closed, but his hand remained in hers, a lifeline connecting them through the night. The next morning brought both hope and concern. Ethan's fever had broken, but he was weak from blood loss, and the wound, though not showing signs of infection, would take time to heal properly. The wagon train continued its journey, moving slowly to accommodate their injured guide. Theresa rode in the back of the wagon with Ethan, changing his bandages and ensuring he drank enough to replace the fluids he'd lost. Her dress, now significantly shorter and missing several strips around the hem, drew raised eyebrows from Mrs. Miller, but no comment. "You'll be quite the scandal when we reach Helena," Ethan remarked on the second day, watching as she checked his bandages. He was propped up on some bedrolls, color gradually returning to his face. I suspect the frontier has seen worse than a shortened skirt, Theresa replied dryly. Besides, I can always say it was the latest fashion from Paris. Ethan chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his wound. Careful, Miss Watson. You'll have me tearing my stitches. Then don't make me laugh, she retorted, though her eyes danced with amusement. As the wagon jolted over a particularly rough patch of trail, Ethan's hand shot out to steady her, gripping her arm. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through Theresa, and she found herself lingering in his grasp longer than necessary. Have you always wanted to be a banker like your father? Ethan asked as she finally moved away, busying herself with organizing the medical supplies. The question surprised her. I haven't given it much thought, she admitted. It was always assumed I would marry well and manage a household. And is that what you want? Ethan pressed, his blue eyes searching her face. Theresa considered the question seriously. I want purpose, she finally said. The hospital work during the war gave me that. But since then, she trailed off, remembering the stifling drawing rooms of Boston society, the endless rounds of tea and gossip. The West offers possibilities that Boston doesn't. Ethan nodded, understanding in his gaze. That it does. For women as well as men, though the challenges are different. What about you? Theresa asked, turning the conversation. Have you always been a guide? A shadow passed over Ethan's face. No. I was a rancher once, had a small spread in Wyoming. Lost it in '73 during the financial panic. He spoke matter-of-factly, but Theresa sensed the old pain behind his words. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. His gaze held hers, sometimes for the better. The wagon hit another bump, breaking the moment. Theresa steadied herself against the side, acutely aware of Ethan watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. We should reach Helena by tomorrow afternoon, she said, desperate to regain her composure. And then what? Ethan asked quietly. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. What indeed? Ethan had been hired to guide them to Helena, where her father would establish the new bank. His job would be done assuming he recovered fully from his wound. My father will need help setting up the homestead, Theresa found herself saying. The land needs clearing, buildings need constructing. Is that an offer of employment, Miss Watson? Ethan's mouth quirked in a half-smile. It could be, she replied carefully. If you're interested. I might be, he said, his voice taking on a softer quality. For the right reasons. Before Theresa could respond, the wagon came to an abrupt halt, throwing her off balance. She caught herself against Ethan's chest, her face inches from his. For one breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. River crossing ahead, her father called from outside, breaking the spell. Everyone prepared a ford. Theresa pulled back, her cheeks flushed. I should help, she murmured, already moving toward the front of the wagon. Ethan caught her hand before she could leave. Theresa, he said, the first time he'd used her given name. We'll finish this conversation later. It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. Yes, Mr. Zachary. We will. The river crossing was manageable but tense, the current stronger than expected due to recent rains in the mountains. Theresa helped secure the supplies, making sure nothing would shift and disturb Ethan's wound during the crossing. By nightfall, they had made camp on the far side of the river, the lights of distant Helena visible on the horizon. They would reach the town by midday tomorrow, ending a journey that had changed Theresa in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she brought Ethan his evening meal, a simple stew Mrs. Miller had prepared, she found him sitting up, testing his strength by cleaning his revolver. Should you be doing that? She asked, setting the bowl beside him. A man's weapons are his responsibility, Ethan replied, though he set the gun aside to accept the food. How far are we from Helena? About 4 hours, Father says. Theresa sat on a crate opposite him. How are you feeling? Ethan considered the question honestly. Like I've been shot, he admitted with a wry smile. But better than yesterday. Your care has made all the difference. The Cherokee poultice helped, Theresa said modestly. It draws out infection. It wasn't just the medicine. Ethan's eyes held hers. Having someone who believes you'll survive. It matters. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. I never doubted you would, she said softly. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Will you miss it? Theresa asked suddenly. The open trail, I mean. Once we reach Helena. Ethan considered the question, looking out at the vast starlit sky. Parts of it. The freedom, the simplicity. But a man can't live on the trail forever. What would you do if you could choose anything? The question had been on her mind since learning about his lost ranch. Start over, he said without hesitation. Find good land, build something that lasts. His gaze returned to her face. Something worth protecting. The implication wasn't lost on Theresa. Her pulse quickened as Ethan set his empty bowl aside and leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. Your father mentioned homesteading land east of Helena. Good water, timber. The kind of place a man could build a life. His voice was casual, but his eyes were intent on her face. The kind of place that might need a partner who knows the territory. A business partner? Theresa asked, her breath catching. That would be one option, Ethan acknowledged, though not the one I'd prefer. The directness of his gaze left little doubt as to his meaning. Theresa felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. In Boston, such a conversation would be scandalous, a near stranger suggesting partnership of any kind to a lady of her standing. But they weren't in Boston, and Ethan Zachary was no stranger, not anymore. Not after he'd taken a bullet for her, not after she'd torn her dress to stanch his bleeding, not after the long hours of care and conversation that had followed. What option would you prefer, Mr. Zachary? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. I think you know, Miss Watson, but I won't presume. You have a life ahead of you in Helena, prospects far better than a cowboy with a bullet wound and empty pockets. Perhaps I should be the judge of my prospects, Theresa replied, surprising herself with her boldness. After all, I've become quite adept at making my own decisions recently. A smile spread across Ethan's face, transforming his rugged features. So you have. He tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer until she was sitting beside him on his bedroll. The impropriety of it should have scandalized her, but instead, Theresa felt only a thrilling sense of rightness. If I weren't injured, Ethan said softly, I'd take you for a walk under those stars and tell you properly how I've come to feel about you these past weeks. But as it stands, Theresa finished for him, we'll have to make do with this wagon. She looked around at their makeshift infirmary, at the medical supplies and torn strips of her dress, at the weapons laid ready for another attack that hadn't come. It seems fitting somehow. It does, Ethan agreed. He reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with exquisite gentleness. Theresa Watson, I have nothing to offer but myself and whatever future we might build together. Is that enough? The vulnerability in his question made her heart ache. This man, who had faced bandits without flinching, now looked at her with uncertainty in his eyes. It's everything, she whispered, and leaned forward to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, mindful of his injury, but it deepened as Ethan's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. Theresa felt as though something that had been locked inside her was finally breaking free, a wild, joyful spirit that matched the vast frontiers surrounding them. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. Your father might have something to say about this, he murmured. My father hired you because he trusted your judgment, Theresa replied. I suspect he'll extend the same courtesy to me. Even so, I should speak with him, Ethan said, ever honorable despite the circumstances. Tomorrow, when we reach Helena. Tomorrow, Theresa agreed, reluctantly moving away as she heard footsteps approaching the wagon. Rest now. You'll need your strength. Ethan caught her hand once more before she could leave. Theresa, he said, his voice low and fervent. Thank you for saving my life. She smiled, squeezing his fingers. We saved each other, I think. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the final leg of their journey to Helena laid out before them. Ethan insisted on riding his horse instead of being carried in the wagon, though Theresa protested that his wound wasn't healed enough. A man should ride into his future on his own 2 feet, or in this case, his own horse, he said stubbornly, allowing Joseph Miller to help him mount. Theresa couldn't argue with the symbolism, even if she worried about the practical aspects. She rode alongside him, watching carefully for any signs that he was overexerting himself. "You're staring, Miss Watson," Ethan remarked after catching her eye for the third time in as many minutes. "I'm monitoring my patient, Mr. Zachary," she corrected primly, though a smile tugged at her lips. "And how is your patient faring?" he asked, adjusting himself in the saddle to ease the pressure on his wound. "Stubborn, but surprisingly resilient," she replied. Then, more softly, "I'm proud of you, Ethan." The use of his given name brought a warmth to his eyes that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Coming from you, that means everything." Their conversation was interrupted as Howard Watson rode back to join them, his expression curious as he observed their easy familiarity. "How are you holding up, Zachary?" he asked. "Well enough, sir," Ethan replied respectfully. "Your daughter is an excellent nurse." "She gets that from her mother," Howard said, his voice softening with old memories. "Catherine had the same healing touch." He cleared his throat, returning to the present. "We'll be in Helena by noon. I've arranged for Dr. Patterson to see you immediately." "Much appreciated, sir," Ethan said. "And if you have a moment before we arrive, I'd like to speak with you about a matter of some importance." Howard's gaze traveled between Ethan and his daughter, taking in their proximity and the unspoken current between them. A knowing expression crossed his face. "I believe I can guess the nature of this matter," he said dryly. "But yes, we should talk." He gestured for Ethan to follow him to the front of the column, leaving Theresa both nervous and hopeful as the two men rode ahead, deep in conversation. Helena appeared on the horizon just as promised, a bustling frontier town that had grown rapidly since the gold strike of the 1860s. Now, in 1878, it was becoming a center of commerce for the territory, with substantial buildings replacing the initial tents and shacks of the gold rush days. Dr. Patterson, true to Howard Watson's word, was waiting for them as they arrived, his concern immediate upon seeing Ethan's condition. "This man should not be on horseback," he scolded as he helped Ethan dismount and led him into his office. "The wound could have reopened at any moment." "It didn't," Ethan pointed out, wincing as the doctor helped him onto an examination table. "Thanks only to Miss Watson's excellent field medicine," Dr. Patterson said after examining the bandages. He looked at Theresa with professional approval. "These are well done. Have you had medical training?" "Only what I learned during the war," Theresa explained, watching anxiously as the doctor unwrapped the bandages to reveal the wound beneath. "Well, it likely saved his life," Patterson declared. "The wound is clean, no infection. With proper rest, which means no horseback riding for at least 2 more weeks, Mr. Zachary, you should make a full recovery." Relief flooded through Theresa. Though she'd believed Ethan would recover, hearing it confirmed by a medical professional lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you, Doctor," Howard Watson said, shaking the man's hand. "Now, I believe we have accommodations arranged at the Montana Hotel while our homestead is being prepared. Zachary, you'll stay with us until you're fully recovered." "That's very generous, sir," Ethan began, but Howard waved away his protests. "It's the least we can do," he said firmly. "Besides, we have matters to discuss regarding your future employment." He shot a meaningful glance at his daughter, whose heart soared at the implication that her father didn't object to Ethan's suit. The Montana Hotel was the finest establishment in Helena, a 3-story structure with actual glass windows and a dining room that served proper meals on china plates. After weeks on the trail, it seemed impossibly luxurious to Theresa. She was shown to a room with a real bed and a wash basin with hot water, while Ethan was settled in a room across the hall. Her father took the room adjacent to hers, maintaining propriety while acknowledging the changing circumstances. After bathing and changing into one of the few dresses that had survived the journey intact, Theresa made her way downstairs to the dining room, where her father and Ethan awaited. Ethan had somehow acquired a fresh shirt and had trimmed his beard, though he still looked pale from his ordeal. He stood as she approached, his eyes warm with appreciation. "Miss Watson," he greeted her. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Zachary," she replied, taking the seat he held for her. "You clean up rather well yourself." Howard Watson watched their exchange with a mixture of amusement and resignation. "I've ordered for us already," he said. "Steak for all after weeks of trail cooking." I thought we deserved it. As they ate, Howard outlined his plans for the homestead and the new bank branch he would be opening in Helena. The land is 15 miles east of town, he explained, spreading a map on the table between bites of steak. Good water from the creek, timber on the north section, and about 80 acres suitable for grazing. Sounds promising, Ethan commented, studying the map with interest. Good defensive position, too, with the hills behind it. Yes, well, I hope we won't need to consider defensive positions too often, Howard said dryly. But after our recent experience, I appreciate the assessment. He folded the map, setting it aside. Now, as to your role in this venture, Zachary. I understand you have an interest in ranching. Yes, sir, Ethan confirmed. I had a small cattle operation in Wyoming before the Panic of '73. And you'd like to try again, Howard stated. It wasn't a question. I would, Ethan said firmly. With the right partner. Howard's gaze shifted to his daughter, who met it steadily. Theresa has always had good judgment, he said after a moment. Her mother was the same way, knew her own mind, even when it contradicted what society expected of her. He turned back to Ethan. I won't pretend this is what I envisioned for my daughter when we left Boston. But then, I never envisioned her tearing her dress to bandage a wounded cowboy or blowing up half a hillside to save our lives, either. Despite the gravity of the conversation, a smile tugged at Ethan's lips. She's full of surprises, sir. Indeed. Howard took a sip of his coffee, considering his next words carefully. The homestead has more land than I need for the house and garden. The rest was meant to be an investment, but I find I'm more interested in banking than ranching. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement. What sort of arrangement? Ethan asked, though the hope in his eyes suggested he already knew. A partnership, Howard proposed. You provide the expertise, I provide the land and initial capital. We split the profits. And in time, if things develop as I suspect they might between you and my daughter, the arrangement could become more permanent. Theresa felt her cheeks warm at her father's directness, but Ethan's response was equally forthright. I intend to court your daughter properly, Mr. Watson, he said. And if she'll have me, to make her my wife. But I want to prove myself worthy first to rebuild what I lost, to show that I can provide for her. A commendable sentiment, Howard acknowledged. And one I respect. But don't wait too long, Zachary. Life on the frontier is uncertain, as we've recently been reminded. Theresa, who had been silent during this exchange about her future, finally spoke up. Perhaps I should have some say in this discussion, she suggested, her tone mild but firm. Both men turned to her with matching expressions of chagrin. Of course, my dear, her father said. What are your thoughts? Theresa looked at Ethan, whose blue eyes held a question and a promise. I believe Mr. Zachary and I have an understanding, she said carefully. But I agree that a proper courtship is in order. As for the business arrangement, it seems sensible to me. I've always wanted to learn more about ranching. You have? Ethan asked, surprised. I have many interests that might surprise you, Mr. Zachary, she replied with a small smile, including a rather detailed knowledge of cattle breeds gained from books in my father's library. Howard laughed at Ethan's expression. I told you she was full of surprises. Catherine and I believed in educating our daughter thoroughly, even in subjects that Boston society deemed unsuitable for young ladies. I'm beginning to see that, Ethan said, looking at Theresa with new appreciation. And I look forward to discovering more of these surprises. The rest of the meal passed pleasantly, with discussion of the practicalities of establishing both the bank and the ranch. By the time they retired for the evening, the foundation of their future had been laid, a partnership that promised to be both professionally and personally fulfilling. As Howard excused himself to speak with some local businessmen in the hotel lobby, Ethan walked Theresa to the foot of the stairs. Your father is a remarkable man, he said quietly. Not many would be so understanding. He wants me to be happy, Theresa replied simply. And he's seen enough of the world to know that happiness doesn't always follow conventional paths. Ethan took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a way that sent shivers up her arm. Are you happy, Theresa? With this arrangement, with the prospect of us? The vulnerability in his question touched her deeply. This man, who had faced death with courage, now feared her rejection more than any bullet. I am, she assured him, squeezing his hand. Happier than I've been in a very long time. Relief washed over his features, followed by a tenderness that made her heart race. "I wish I could kiss you right now," he murmured, glancing at the hotel staff and patrons who might observe them. "There will be time for that," Theresa promised, reluctantly releasing his hand. "When you're fully recovered. Then I'll be sure to follow the doctor's orders to the letter," Ethan said with a grin that promised future delights. "Good night, Miss Watson. Dream of cattle and open ranges." "And cowboys," she suggested with a raised eyebrow. "Just one cowboy, if you please," he replied, his voice dropping to a husky timbre that made her blush. "Good night, Mr. Zachary," she said softly, and ascended the stairs with his gaze following her every step. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as the Watsons established themselves in Helena. Howard secured the building for his bank and began the process of hiring staff, while Theresa oversaw the preparation of their homestead. Ethan, following Dr. Patterson's strict orders, remained in town, his strength gradually returning as his wound healed. True to his word, he courted Theresa properly, escorting her to church services and community gatherings as his health improved. Their growing attachment did not go unnoticed in the small community, but the story of how they had met, and especially of how Theresa had saved Ethan's life with her quick thinking and courage, had spread quickly, lending a romantic glow to their courtship that even the most gossip-prone citizens couldn't criticize. By the time Ethan was declared fit to ride again, the homestead was ready for occupation. The main house, a sturdy 2-story structure of timber and stone, stood ready to welcome the Watsons, while a smaller cabin had been constructed nearby for Ethan. "It's perfect," Theresa declared as she walked through the house for the first time, admiring the large windows that looked out over the rolling landscape. "You can see for miles in every direction. Good for spotting approaching visitors," Ethan commented practically, "and for watching the cattle once we get them." He had ridden out with Theresa and her father to see the homestead, his first significant journey since being shot. Though he moved more carefully than before, his strength was clearly returning, his lean frame filling out again as he regained the weight lost during his recovery. Howard Watson nodded approvingly as he inspected the construction. "The builders did good work," he said. "Solid foundation, tight roof. It should withstand the Montana winters. And the storage cellar is deeper than I expected," Theresa added, having explored every corner of their new home. "We'll be able to keep plenty of preserves for winter." As her father continued his inspection, Ethan drew Theresa outside to show her the corrals he had designed for the cattle they would soon purchase. "I've arranged to buy a small herd to start 30 head of Hereford Cross, good stock for this climate. They'll arrive next week." His enthusiasm was infectious, his blue eyes alight with plans for their future. Theresa found herself caught up in his vision, adding suggestions about pasture rotation and breeding that clearly impressed him. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked as they walked the perimeter of what would become their grazing land. "Books, mostly," Theresa admitted. "And I spent a summer on my uncle's farm in Vermont when I was 16. It was meant to be a punishment for some perceived impropriety, but I loved every minute of it." Ethan laughed, the sound rich and warm in the clear mountain air. "What was the impropriety, if I may ask?" "I was caught reading a medical text that belonged to our family doctor," Theresa said, smiling at the memory. "Apparently, young ladies weren't supposed to know about human anatomy." "The horror," Ethan teased, taking her hand as they walked. The casual intimacy of the gesture felt natural now, after weeks of growing closer. "And did your rural exile cure you of such unseemly interests?" "Hardly," Theresa replied. "Uncle Samuel had a fascinating collection of agricultural journals. I learned more about cattle breeding that summer than my father ever intended." They had reached a small rise overlooking the creek that bordered the property. Ethan stopped, turning to face her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Theresa Watson," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I know we agreed on a proper courtship, and it's only been a few weeks. But nearly dying has a way of clarifying what's important." He took both her hands in his touch gentle yet firm. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I began falling in love with you the moment you tore your dress to save my life, and every day since has only confirmed what I already knew." Theresa felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at his declaration. "Ethan, let me finish," he said softly. I promised your father I'd prove myself worthy of you, and I still intend to do that. But I don't want to wait to tell you how I feel, or to ask." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Would you consider becoming my wife, once we've established the ranch and proven it can support us?" The question, though expected given the direction of their relationship, still made Theresa's heart soar. This was not the marriage proposal she had imagined as a girl in Boston, with formal parlors and nervous suitors seeking her father's permission. It was better honest, direct, and born of genuine connection rather than social expectation. "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "I would be honored to be your wife, Ethan Zachary." His face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it took her breath away. Without further words, he drew her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that contained all the promise of their future together, passionate, yet tender, strong yet gentle, just like the man himself. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he murmured. "But I will." "I don't need a ring," Theresa replied. "I just need you, alive and whole." He chuckled, his arms still around her waist. "Nevertheless, a proper engagement requires a ring. Perhaps when we go to town next week to meet the cattle drive. If it makes you happy," she conceded, too content in his embrace to argue. They stood together on the hillside, looking out over what would become their home and livelihood, until Howard's voice called them back to the house. As they walked hand in hand toward their future, Theresa reflected on the strange path that had brought her here, from Boston society to the Montana frontier, from banker's daughter to rancher's fiancée. It wasn't the life she had expected, but standing beside Ethan, feeling the solid strength of him next to her, she knew it was exactly where she was meant to be. The months that followed were filled with hard work and quiet joy as the ranch took shape around them. The cattle arrived as promised, along with 2 experienced hands Ethan had hired to help with the herd. A sturdy barn rose behind the main house, and fences marked the boundaries of their land. Howard Watson divided his time between the homestead and his bank in Helena, gradually becoming more comfortable with frontier life. He watched with pride as his daughter transformed from a proper Boston lady into a capable ranch woman, equally at home directing the household or helping with calving. By Christmas of 1878, the ranch was well established, showing every sign of becoming a profitable venture. Howard hosted a celebration at the homestead, inviting their neighbors from miles around to share in their good fortune and to formally announce Theresa and Ethan's engagement. The house glowed with lamplight and pine boughs as guests arrived on horseback and in wagons, bringing dishes to share and gifts to exchange. A large spruce tree stood in the corner of the main room, decorated with paper ornaments Theresa had crafted and strings of cranberries and popcorn. "You've created a real home here," Mrs. Miller observed as she helped Theresa arrange platters of food on the dining table. "It's hard to believe you've only been here 6 months. It feels like longer," Theresa admitted, adjusting a bowl of preserves. In the best possible way. Her gaze drifted to the window, where she could see Ethan showing some of the men the new stallion he'd purchased for breeding. The December sun caught in his hair, turning it to gold as he laughed at something one of the neighbors said. "That man loves you something fierce," Mrs. Miller commented, following her gaze. "The way he looks at you, well, it reminds me of how my Joseph looked at me when we were newly wed." Theresa smiled, unable to deny the truth of the observation. "We've been through a lot together in a short time. Nothing bonds people like facing danger side by side," Mrs. Miller agreed. "Though I hope you've seen the last of such excitement." The dinner was a festive affair, with more food than Theresa had seen since leaving Boston. Venison roast, wild turkey, fresh bread, and pies of every description covered the table as Howard Watson raised a glass to toast their first Christmas in Montana. "To new beginnings," he said, his gaze warm as it rested on his daughter and future son-in-law. "And to family, both old and new." "To family," the guests echoed, glasses raised. After the meal, as their neighbors gathered around the fireplace to sing carols, Ethan drew Theresa outside onto the porch. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing in the vast Montana sky with a brilliance she still found breathtaking after months on the frontier. "I have something for you," Ethan said, reaching into his pocket. "A Christmas gift and something more." He produced a small box wrapped in silver paper, presenting it to her with a solemnity that made her heart quicken. "Open it," he urged softly. With trembling fingers, Theresa unwrapped the package and opened the box. Inside lay a ring, a simple band of gold set with a single perfect diamond that caught the starlight and reflected it back in miniature constellations. "It was my mother's," Ethan explained as she stared at the beautiful piece. "The only thing I kept when I lost the ranch. I had it sized for you and Helena last week." "Ethan," Theresa breathed, overcome with emotion. "It's beautiful." He took the ring from the box and held it poised at the tip of her finger. "Theresa Watson, will you marry me? Not someday in the future when the ranch is established, but now, as soon as the circuit preacher returns to Helena next month." "Yes," she answered without hesitation, her heart too full for more elaborate words. "Yes, now and always." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. Then he drew her close, his kiss warming her despite the winter chill. When they returned inside, hand in hand with Theresa's ring catching the firelight, Howard Watson needed only one glance to understand what had transpired. He raised his glass once more, silencing the room with a tap of his fork. "It seems we have another cause for celebration," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the assembled guests. "My daughter and Mr. Zachary have just become officially engaged, with a wedding planned for next month." Cheers and congratulations filled the room as neighbors pressed forward to admire the ring and offer their best wishes. In the midst of the celebration, Theresa caught Ethan's eye across the room, a private moment of connection amidst the crowd. His gaze held the same promise it had since that day by the rocks when he'd taken a bullet to save her life, a promise of protection, of partnership, of a love as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above them. As the party continued around them, Theresa thought of how far they had come since that dusty day on the trail. The journey had been unexpected, even dangerous at times, but it had led her here, to this moment of perfect happiness, to the arms of a man who loved her not despite her strength and independence, but because of them. And that, she realized, was worth every torn dress and bullet wound along the way. The wedding took place on a crisp January day in 1879, with snow blanketing the hills around Helena and ice crystals dancing in the air. The small church was filled with well-wishers as Theresa walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her dress a creation of ivory satin and lace that had been sent from Boston at Howard's request. Ethan waited at the altar, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. But it was the look in his eyes as she approached that Theresa would remember forever, a mixture of awe, joy, and steadfast love that made her feel like the most precious person in the world. The ceremony was simple, their vows exchanged with clear voices that carried to every corner of the church. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "Mrs. Zachary," he whispered as they turned to face their friends, his voice filled with wonder at the new reality of their union. "Mr. Zachary," she replied, squeezing his hand as they walked back down the aisle together, into their future. The celebration continued at the Montana Hotel, where Howard had arranged a reception that blended Boston elegance with frontier practicality. Dancing and feasting lasted well into the evening, until finally the newly married couple took their leave, returning to the ranch that was now truly their home. As spring turned the hills green around their homestead, the ranch flourished under their combined care. Theresa proved to have a natural affinity for breeding and raising cattle, her book knowledge supplemented by practical experience, while Ethan's skills with horses and ranching operations ensured their venture remained profitable even through the unpredictable weather of their first full year. Howard divided his time between his successful bank in Helena and the comfortable room they maintained for him at the ranch, gradually allowing his daughter and son-in-law to take full responsibility for the operation. By their first anniversary, it was clear that the Z-W Ranch, named for both their surnames, would be a lasting legacy. On a warm evening in July of 1880, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Theresa turned to her husband with news she had been saving for a special moment. I visited Dr. Patterson in town yesterday, she said, her hand finding Ethan's on the arm of his chair. He confirmed what I've suspected for a few weeks now. Ethan's brow furrowed with immediate concern. Are you ill? No. Theresa laughed, squeezing his fingers. Quite the opposite. We're going to have a baby, Ethan, in February. For a moment, he simply stared at her, processing the news. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure it made her heart ache. A baby, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Our baby. He was on his knees beside her chair in an instant, his hand reaching out to touch her still flat stomach with reverent gentleness. Are you feeling well? Do you need anything? Should I? Theresa silenced his flood of questions with a kiss, laughing against his lips. I'm perfectly well, she assured him. And what I need most is exactly what I have you, beside me. Ethan gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of porcelain. I love you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Both of you. And we love you, Theresa replied, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky, revealing the first stars of evening. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, Theresa reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance meeting on a dangerous trail to the creation of new life, their story had been one of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering love. The cowboy who had been shot protecting her had become the husband who protected her in gentler ways with his strength, his partnership, and his enduring devotion. And she, who had once torn her dress to stop his bleeding, now carried their child beneath her heart, the ultimate testament to the life they had built together. In the vastness of the Montana Territory, on land that was now truly their own, Ethan and Theresa Zachary had found more than a home. They had found each other, and in doing so, had discovered the greatest frontier of all, a love without boundaries, as limitless as the western sky above them. Catherine Elizabeth Zachary was born on a snowy February morning in 1881, her first cries filling the ranch house with new life as Dr. Patterson proclaimed her a perfect little cowgirl and placed her in her mother's waiting arms. Ethan, who had paced the hallway through the long night of Theresa's labor, was overcome with emotion at the sight of his wife holding their daughter. The tiny girl had a dusting of dark hair like her mother's, and, when she briefly opened her eyes, a hint of her father's sky-blue gaze. She's beautiful, he whispered, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed to better see the miracle they had created. Just like her mother. She has your chin, Theresa said softly, tracing the tiny features with a gentle finger. And I suspect she'll have your determination as well. Howard Watson, summoned from Helena for the birth of his first grandchild, stood in the doorway watching the new family with undisguised delight. She's perfect, he agreed, his voice gruff with emotion. Catherine would have been so proud. Naming their daughter after Theresa's mother had been an easy decision, a way to honor the woman who had instilled such strength and compassion in her daughter. The middle name, Elizabeth, had been Ethan's mother's name, connecting the child to both sides of her heritage. As winter gave way to spring, little Catherine thrived, growing stronger each day under the devoted care of her parents. Ethan proved to be a natural father, as comfortable cradling his daughter as he was handling a spirited horse or negotiating a cattle sale. By the time Catherine was walking, toddling determinately across the ranch house floor with her grandfather in gleeful pursuit, the Z-Bar W had established itself as one of the most successful operations in the territory. Their breeding program, which combined Ethan's practical knowledge with Theresa's scientific approach, had produced a herd renowned for its hardiness and quality. In the spring of 1883, as they celebrated their 4th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Theresa on a ride to the spot where he had first told her he loved her, the small rise overlooking the creek that bordered their property. "Do you remember what you said to me here?" he asked as they dismounted, tying their horses to a young cottonwood that had grown considerably in the years since their first visit. "That I didn't need a ring, just you alive and whole," Theresa recalled, smiling at the memory. "And I said a proper engagement required a ring anyway," Ethan continued, taking her hand where his mother's diamonds still sparkled on her finger. "I've been thinking about that day a lot lately." "Have you?" Theresa asked, curious about the thoughtful expression on her husband's face. Ethan nodded, leading her to the crest of the hill where the view stretched for miles in every direction. The ranch buildings were visible in the distance, solid and permanent against the landscape. New corrals and outbuildings had been added as the operation expanded, and the garden Theresa had planted that first summer now flourished with vegetables and flowers. "I promised to prove myself worthy of you," Ethan said quietly. "To build something that would support us, that would last." "And you have," Theresa assured him, leaning into his side. "Beyond what either of us imagined." "We have," he corrected gently. "It's been our partnership that made it possible." He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "When I took that bullet protecting you, I had no idea I was saving my own future as well. Every success we've had, every joy, including Catherine, stems from that moment." Theresa felt tears prick her eyes at the emotion in his voice. "It works both ways," she said. "When I tore my dress to stop your bleeding, I was saving the man who would become my heart." Ethan drew her into his arms, his kiss as tender as it had been on their wedding day, yet deepened by the years of love and shared experience between them. When they finally parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you, Theresa Zachary," he murmured. "More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, her heart full to bursting. "My cowboy, my husband, my life." They stood together on the hillside, the warm spring breeze carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers around them, until Catherine's nap time drew them back to the house, where Howard was watching over his sleeping granddaughter. As they rode side by side toward home, Theresa reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here, from danger to safety, from strangers to lovers, from a torn dress and a bullet wound to a thriving ranch and a beautiful daughter. Their story, like the frontier itself, had been shaped by courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond formed in a moment of crisis. But unlike the wild landscape that surrounded them, their love had been tamed into something enduring, a shelter against life's storms, a constant in a changing world. The cowboy had been shot protecting her, and she had torn her dress to stop his bleeding. But what they had built together in the years since transcended that dramatic beginning, becoming a legacy of love that would endure long after the frontier days had passed into history. As the ranch house came into view, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney, and Howard visible on the porch with a newly awakened Catherine in his arms, Ethan and Theresa exchanged a smile that contained all the words they needed to say. They were home, they were together, and their greatest adventures still lay ahead.